The wind came howling across the open plains that day in 1895, a relentless force that carried the scent of dry grass and distant snow. It tugged at Clara Whitaker's faded dress and whipped strands of her dark hair across her face as she stood on the sagging porch of the ranch house. The notice from the bank was clutched in her roughened hands, its edges frayed from the number of times she had read and reread the cold words that stripped her of everything. The ranch was no longer hers. The bank had taken it to settle the debts that had mounted like storm clouds over the past years of drought and hardship. The land around her stretched out indifferent and vast, the earth cracked and parched under the late autumn sun. No rain had fallen in months, leaving the fields barren and the cattle thin shadows of what they once were. Hawks circled lazily overhead, their sharp eyes scanning for any sign of weakness, mirroring the way the world seemed to wait for her to fall. Claire's boots were planted firmly on the wooden planks, but her legs felt unsteady as if the ground itself was shifting beneath her. She had not slept the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of what would become of her and the 3 children who depended on her. Inside the house, the sounds of her young ones drifted out through the open doorway. Thomas, her boy of 10 years, was trying to keep his siblings calm, his voice low and steady as he spoke of stories from better times. Emily, the girl of 7 years, held her little brother Samuel, who was 5 years old, close to her chest, her small hands stroking his hair in a gesture that was too mature for her age. They had heard the bank representative arrive earlier that morning, his horse kicking up dust as he delivered the final blow. Claire had faced him alone, signing the papers with a hand that did not shake, though her heart was breaking. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind wash over her, carrying memories that flooded her senses. She could still smell the fresh-cut hay from the first harvest when her husband had been alive, feel the warmth of his hand in hers as they walked the fields together. He had built this ranch with his own sweat and blood, dreaming of a legacy for their family. But a fever had taken him 2 years ago, leaving her to fight the elements and the creditors alone. The nights had been long and cold, filled with worry over the loans that grew with every failed crop. She had risen before dawn each day, her back aching from the labor, teaching the children to help with the chores, showing them how to milk the cows and mend the fences. But it had not been enough. The bank had no patience for a widow's struggles. The burden of those years pressed down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. She opened her eyes and looked out across the yard where the wind was erasing the tracks left by the bankman's horse. It was as if the land itself was trying to forget the intrusion. Clara reached down and picked up a handful of the dry soil, letting it slip through her fingers like the dreams that had slipped away. The grains were coarse and warm, a reminder of the life she had poured into this place. Her children had played here, their laughter echoing across the plains in happier days. Now the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional low of a hungry cow in the corral. A sudden gust nearly knocked her off balance, and she steadied herself against the porch post, her fingers digging into the wood until splinters pricked her skin. The pain was sharp, but grounding, a small thing compared to the emptiness inside. She thought of the journey ahead, loading the wagon with their few belongings and heading to the nearest town, where work as a laundress or seamstress might barely keep them fed. The thought of her children going hungry twisted her stomach. Thomas was already too serious for his age, Emily too quiet, and Samuel too clingy. She would not let them suffer more than they had. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land, Clara turned back toward the house. But then she paused. In the distance, a figure on horseback appeared on the horizon, moving steadily toward the ranch. The rider was a lone silhouette against the fading light, the sound of hooves faint but growing. She watched, her heart quickening despite herself. The world had taken much, but perhaps it was not yet done with her. The children called out from inside, their voices pulling her back, but the rider continued his approach, a spark of the unexpected in the midst of her collapse. Ride into history with Wild West Chronicles. Hit subscribe. The rider drew closer, dust rising in a thin veil behind the horse's steady gait. Claire watched him without moving, her body taut as a bowstring. The man wore a weathered duster, the color of old tobacco, the brim of his hat pulled low against the slant of the sun. He carried no rifle across his saddle, only a coiled rope and a canteen that slapped softly against the horse's flank with each step. When he reined up at the edge of the yard, the horse blew once nostrils wide, then stood still. The man lifted his head. His face was sun-carved, lined deeper than his years should have allowed, perhaps 35, perhaps older. A thin scar ran from the corner of his left eye, down toward the jaw, pale against the brown of his skin. He did not smile, but his eyes held no threat either. They simply looked at her steady and unhurried. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, rough from dust or disuse. "Name's Jonah Calder. Heard in town the bank was foreclosing today. Thought I might find you still here." Clara felt the children press against the doorway behind her. Thomas stepped forward half a pace, small fists clenched at his sides. She placed a hand on his shoulder without looking back. "You're a long way from town, Mr. Calder," she said, "and I've got nothing left worth taking." "Didn't come to take." He swung down from the saddle boots, striking the hard-packed earth. The horse lowered its head to graze at a tuft of yellowed grass that had somehow survived the summer. Jonah kept his hands visible, palms open. "Came because I knew your husband, Eli Whitaker. We rode together for a spell before he settled here. Never got the chance to pay respects after he passed." The name struck her like cold water. She had not heard anyone speak it aloud in months. The sound of it in another man's mouth made her throat close. "He's been gone 2 years," she said. "Respect don't feed children." Jonah nodded once as though the words were expected. He glanced past her toward the sagging barn, the empty corral, the windmill that no longer turned because the well had gone dry. "Bank's giving you 30 days to clear out," he said. "That right, 30 days," she echoed. The number sounded small when spoken so plainly. He looked back at her. "I've got a place 12 miles north. Not much, but the spring still runs. House is sound. There's room." Clara felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet, but something close. She forced it down. "I don't take charity, Mr. Calder." "Ain't charity," he said. "I need hands. Cattle thinned out last winter. Fences need mending. Children can help with the lighter work. You cook." She gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "I've kept 3 alive on less than nothing." "Yes, I cook." He studied her a long moment. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small burlap sack. He set it on the lowest porch step. "Flour, coffee, couple tins of peaches." Was headed to town anyway. He stepped back. "Think on it. I'll be back this way in 3 days. If you're still here and you want the work, I'll help you load the wagon. If not, I'll ride on." Clara looked down at the sack. The sight of it, the simple generosity of it, made her chest ache in a way the foreclosure notice never had. "Why?" she asked, voice barely above the wind. Jonah turned toward his horse, fingers already on the reins. He paused. "Eli once pulled me out of a river I had no business being in. Never got to square that debt." He mounted, settled his hat. "This ain't payment. Just something owed." He touched the brim and turned the horse north. Clara watched him ride until horse and rider were only a dark shape against the bronze horizon. Then she bent and lifted the sack. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, Emily had already lit the lamp. Samuel sat on the floor, hugging his knees, eyes wide. Thomas stood at the window watching the rider disappear. "Who was that man?" Mama Emily asked. Clara set the sack on the table. She opened it slowly, letting the scent of coffee rise into the room. "Someone who remembers your papa," she said. She did not tell them the rest. Not yet. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind claw at the roof shingles. The children slept in their narrow beds, breathing soft and even. Clara turned onto her side and stared at the wall where Eli's old rifle still hung above the mantel. She thought of Jonah Calder's scarred face, his quiet voice, the way he had not looked at her as though she were already broken. 30 days. She closed her eyes. For the first time in months, the darkness did not feel quite so heavy. 3 days passed, like slow clouds across an empty sky. Clara spent them in motion, never still long enough for despair to settle. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled, mended the last good shirt Thomas owned, packed a few things worth keeping into 2 wooden crates, Eli's Bible with its cracked leather cover, the children's baby clothes. She could not bear to burn a tin box of letters tied with faded ribbon. She worked until her body ached and her mind went quiet. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind shifted north, carrying the faint scent of pine from the distant hills. Claire stood at the stove, boiling the last of the coffee Jonah had left. The children ate cornbread and the final jar of peach preserves in silence. Thomas kept glancing toward the window. Emily traced patterns in the sugar spilled on the table. Samuel pressed against Clara's leg thumb in his mouth, watching her face as though she might vanish. When the hoofbeats came, they sounded different, slower, deliberate. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. Jonah rode the same horse, but this time he led a second animal behind him, a sturdy bay mare with a broad back and kind eyes. A light wagon followed empty, except for a folded tarp and a coil of rope. He reined up and dismounted without flourish. His gaze moved over the crates, already waiting on the porch, then back to her. "You're ready," he said. Not a question. Clara lifted her chin. "We're not beggars. We'll work for whatever roof you offer." Jonah gave the smallest nod. "That's the understanding." He did not rush her. He helped Thomas lift the heavier crate into the wagon bed while Clara folded quilts around Samuel, so the ride would not bruise him. Emily climbed up beside her brother, clutching the tin box of letters to her chest like a shield. When everything was loaded, Clara stood a moment looking back at the house. The door hung open. Dust drifted across the threshold. She closed it softly, the latch clicking like a period at the end of a long sentence. Jonah offered her a hand. She took it, calloused palm against calloused palm, and let him steady her onto the wagon seat. He tied the mare to the tailgate for her to ride later, if she chose, then swung up beside her. The children sat behind them on the folded tarp. No one spoke as he clicked the team into motion. The first miles were quiet. The plains rolled beneath the wheels, unchanging at first, then slowly giving way to shallow draws and scattered cedar. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, feeling the vibration of the wagon in her bones. She stole glances at Jonah's profile, the scar that pulled slightly when he turned his head the way his fingers held the reins loose, but sure. He smelled of leather and wood smoke and something sharper, pine sap, perhaps. After an hour, Samuel fell asleep against Emily's shoulder. Thomas watched the horizon as though expecting trouble to rise from it. Clara cleared her throat. "You said you rode with Eli." Jonah kept his eyes on the ruts ahead. 2 summers. Up in the Wyoming Territory. We were young. Thought we knew more than we did. He never spoke much of those years. Most men don't. He paused. He was steady. Never raised his voice when another man would have drawn iron. Saved my hide more than once. Clara felt a small, unexpected warmth bloom beneath her ribs. He was like that here, too. Quiet when it mattered. Jonah glanced at her, then brief searching. "You've carried it alone since." "Not by choice." "No," he said. "Never is." The sun climbed higher. Heat pressed down. Jonah stopped at a trickle of water hidden in a cut bank, let the horses drink, passed around the canteen. The children stretched their legs. Samuel ran small circles in the dust until Emily called him back. Clara watched Jonah check the wagon's undercarriage, his movements economical, practiced. There was no wasted motion in him. When they rolled on again, she asked, "This place of yours, how long have you held it 7 years. Bought the improvements off a man who lost his wife to the fever. Land was cheap after that. Spring never dried, though. That's worth more than title papers some years. She thought of her own well, the bucket coming up lighter each week until it brought only dust. A spring, she said softly. The children have never seen clear water year-round. They will now. The words landed plain without promise or pity. Clara felt something loosen inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of breathing easier. By late afternoon, the land began to rise. Low hills appeared dotted with pion and bunchgrass. Jonah pointed with his chin. There, a small valley opened before them, cupped between ridges. A log house stood near the base of the northern slope, smoke idling from the chimney. A creek cut through the meadow, its banks lined with willow. Cattle grazed in scattered bunches, their hides shining copper in the slant light. A windmill turned lazily, pulling water into a wooden tank that overflowed into a stone-lined trough. Clara felt the children stir behind her. Emily whispered, "It's pretty." Jonah drew the team to a halt in the yard. He set the brake and looked at Clara. "Welcome," he said. She met his eyes. For the first time since the bank notice, she did not look away first. The house smelled of cured cedar and old fires. Clara stepped inside first, the children crowding close behind her like wary birds. The main room was spare, but clean, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a scarred oak table, 4 ladder-back chairs, a shelf of tin cups, and mismatched plates. A narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms and a lean-to kitchen. Sunlight poured through the single window, striping the pine floorboards gold. Jonah set the first crate down near the door without speaking. He moved like a man accustomed to silence, carrying the second crate. Then the quilts, then the small trunk that held Clara's sewing kit and the children's spare shoes. When everything was inside, he straightened, dusted his palms against his thighs. "Take the back room," he said. "It's got 2 beds. I'll sleep out here by the fire till we figure something better." Clara opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. The offer was practical, not gallant. She nodded once. Thomas explored first, running his fingers along the smooth logs, peering into the cold hearth. Emily stood in the doorway of the bedroom, eyes wide at the sight of real window glass instead of oiled paper. Samuel clung to Clara's skirt, thumb back in his mouth, watching Jonah with solemn curiosity. Jonah caught the boy's stare. He crouched to Samuel's level, slow, so as not to startle. "You like horses?" he asked. Samuel nodded, small and serious. "Got a gentle one out back. Name's Daisy. You can meet her tomorrow if your mama says it's all right." Samuel looked up at Clara. She gave the barest tilt of her head. The boy's face opened into a shy smile, the first real one in weeks. Supper was simple beans. Jonah had soaked the night before, cornbread Clara mixed with the last of the flour he'd brought, coffee so strong it could wake the dead. They ate at the table, together. No one spoke much. The clink of spoons against tin filled the room. Outside, crickets started up as the light bled out of the sky. After the children were in bed, 3 small bodies curled under the same quilt. Breathing already slowing, Clara returned to the main room. Jonah sat on the hearthstones, cleaning his knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape was the only sound besides the wind against the eaves. She stood just inside the doorway, arms folded. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "We can find work in town. I won't be anyone's burden." Jonah kept his eyes on the blade. "You're not. Told you I need help. Cattle don't feed themselves. Fences don't mend themselves. And I don't cook worth a damn." She almost smiled. Almost. He tested the edge with his thumb, then sheathed the knife. "Eli used to say a man's only as good as the ground he stands on. This ground's been good to me. Figure I owe it to pass some of that along." Clara crossed to the table and began stacking the plates. He never told me much about the years before we met. Said it was another life. Jonah leaned back against the stones, elbows on his knees. It was. We were range detectives for spell-tracking rustlers, breaking up claim jumpers. Hard country, harder men. Eli was the only one who never lost his decency. Saved it for when it mattered. She set the plates down harder than she meant to. He kept it here, too, until he couldn't anymore. Jonah studied her in the low firelight. You've kept it for the children. That's harder. The words landed soft, but they struck deep. Clara felt her throat tighten. She turned away, busying her hands with a rag. Jonah stood. I'll check the stock. Get some sleep if you can. He went out into the dark. Clara listened to his boots, crossed the yard, heard the creak of the corral gate. She stayed at the table until the fire burned low, until the house settled into its own quiet rhythm. The next weeks passed in a rhythm of work and small discoveries. Clara rose before dawn, learned the shape of Jonah's place the way she had once learned her own. She mended fence wire until her palms blistered, helped drive the cattle to better grass, taught Emily how to gather eggs from the henhouse without getting pecked. Thomas followed Jonah like a shadow, learning to splice rope to read a horse's mood by the flick of its ears. Samuel trailed Daisy the mare, chattering to her in a language only they understood. Jonah watched them without comment most days. But sometimes, when Clara was wrist-deep in bread dough or pinning laundry to the line, she caught him looking not at her body, but at the way she moved through the work, steady and uncomplaining. There was something unguarded in his gaze, then something almost wistful. One evening after the children were asleep, she found him on the porch step, staring at the stars. She sat beside him, leaving space between them. "You ever think of marrying again?" she asked. The question surprised her as much as it must have surprised him. Jonah took a slow breath. Thought about it once. Long time ago. Girl named Mara. She wanted a house in town, children, church on Sunday. I couldn't give her any of it. Not then. Maybe not ever. Clara looked at the same stars he did. What happened to her? Married a storekeeper. Has 4 boys now. Sends me a card at Christmas. He gave a small, dry laugh. I keep them in a drawer. Don't know why. Clara felt the silence stretch, comfortable now instead of heavy. I don't know if I can ever love like that again, she said. Not the way I did with Eli. Jonah turned his head slightly. Don't have to be the same. Just has to be true. She met his eyes then. In the starlight, they looked almost silver. Neither of them moved closer. Neither moved away. Winter came early that year, riding in on a wind that smelled of snow and iron. The first flakes fell the morning Clara woke to find the creek iced at the edges, thin glass over moving water. She stood at the kitchen window, breath fogging the pane, watching the world turn white and quiet. The children pressed their noses to the glass beside her, marveling at the way the meadow disappeared under a soft blanket. Samuel asked if the cows would be cold. Clara told him they had thick hides in each other, and that was enough. Jonah had risen before dawn to break ice in the stock tank. She saw him out there now, axe rising and falling in steady rhythm, steam rising from the horse's back as it stood nearby. His coat was open at the throat despite the cold. He worked as though the weather were only another chore. When he finished, he straightened, wiped his brow with the back of his glove, and looked toward the house. Their eyes met through the frost-rimmed window. He gave the smallest lift of his chin a greeting, nothing more, and turned back to the horses. Days shortened. Work changed with the season. Clara learned to render tallow for candles, to card wool from the few sheep Jonah kept, to bake bread in the Dutch oven buried in coals. The children helped where they could, Thomas splitting kindling until his hands blistered, then calloused, Emily learning to churn butter, her small arms growing stronger with each turn, Samuel trailing Jonah to the barn carrying the milk pail when it was half empty, proud of the weight he could manage. One evening after supper, Jonah spread an old map across the table. The paper was yellowed edges frayed marked with pencil lines and coffee rings. He traced a finger along a faint trail that led north into the hills. Used to run Mustangs up there, he said. Before the fences came, Eli and I caught a few together. Good stock. Wild but honest. Clara leaned closer, the lamplight catching the silver threads in her hair. You still go sometimes, when the quiet gets too loud. He glanced at her. Thought I might take Thomas with me next spring. If he wants. Thomas's head came up fast. I want. Jonah smiled, small, rare gone in a breath. Then we'll see. Clara felt something shift inside her, subtle as a door, settling into its frame. She looked at her son's face, bright, eager, and then at Jonah's hands resting on the map. They were scarred steady. She thought of Eli's hands, how they had once held hers the same way, and the ache was still there, but softer now, like an old bruise under new skin. The doubts came at night when the house creaked and the wind howled under the eaves. She lay awake, listening to the children breathe, wondering if she was stealing their future by staying or giving them, one by risking it. Jonah had never spoken of permanence. He offered work, shelter, kindness, but no promises. And she had none to give in return. Not yet. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the southern ridge. Clara saw him first from the porch, a black shape against the snow. She felt her stomach drop. Jonah was in the barn. She called the children inside, told them to stay put, then walked out to meet the stranger halfway across the yard. The man was older, face wind-burned, eyes small and shrewd under a flat-brimmed hat. He reined up, looked her over like she was livestock. You, Claire Whitaker. I am. Name's Harlan Crow. Represent the First Territorial Bank out of Cheyenne. Word is Jonah Calder's taken in a widow and her get. Thought I'd see for myself. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. You've seen. Now ride on. Crow smiled thin and without warmth. Calder's got a mortgage on this place. Payments are current, but the board don't like loose arrangements. Man takes in strays, next thing you know, he's got a family he can't feed when the market turns. Bank's got rules about moral hazard. Jonah's business is his own. Not when it's secured by our money. He leaned forward in the saddle. You tell him Harlan Crow stopped by. Tell him the note comes due in full come April. No extensions this time. And if he's got dependents now, maybe he ought to think on selling before the sheriff does it for him. He touched his hat brim and turned the horse. Clara watched him ride out tracks dark against the snow. Her hands shook, not from cold. Jonah found her still standing there when he came from the barn. He read her face in an instant. Who was it, bank man? Crow. Jonah's jaw tightened. He looked at the retreating rider, then back at her. What'd he say? She told him word for word. When she finished, Jonah exhaled through his nose, a sound like a bull penned too long. I knew the note was there, he said. Thought I had till fall to square it. Market's been hard. Clara wrapped her arms around herself. You never said. Didn't want to burden you. You've carried enough. She looked at him, really looked. The scar on his face stood out sharp in the winter light. We're the burden now. No. The word came quick, almost fierce. You're not. He stepped closer, close enough she could smell the hay on his coat, the faint pine on his skin. I've been alone here 7 years. Thought that was how it would stay. Then you came, and the house got voices in it again. Laughter. Footsteps that aren't mine. I don't want to lose that. Clara felt her throat close. And if the bank takes it, then we find another place. Together. He reached out slow and brushed a snowflake from her cheek with his thumb. The touch lingered a heartbeat longer than it needed to. I'm not asking for charity, Clara. I'm asking for time, and maybe more if you'll let it be." She didn't pull away. She didn't speak. She only nodded once, small and certain. Behind them, the door opened. Thomas stepped out, coat unbuttoned, eyes going from one to the other. "Everything all right?" Mama Clara turned to him, managed a smile. "Everything's going to be." Jonah looked at the boy.
"Saddle Daisy tomorrow."
"We'll check the upper pasture. See if the Mustang trails are still there." Thomas grinned and ran back inside to tell the others. Jonah looked back at Clara. The snow kept falling soft and steady, covering the tracks Harlan Crow had left. The snow deepened through December, blanketing the valley in a hush that made every sound matter more. Footsteps crunched like breaking glass. The windmill creaked once, twice, then fell silent when the mechanism froze. Clara learned the feel of the house in winter, how the cold crept under the door despite the rolled blanket she wedged there, how the fire's warmth never quite reached the corners, how the children's laughter still managed to fill the spaces anyway. Jonah taught them all the small rituals of survival. He showed Thomas how to read the tracks of coyotes that skirted the fence line at dusk, how to set snares without cruelty. With Emily, he gathered kindling from the deadfall in the draw, teaching her which wood smoked least and burned longest. Samuel followed everywhere, small boots leaving prints inside Jonah's larger ones. Claire watched from the porch, sometimes arms folded against the chill, feeling something unfamiliar take root, not dependence but belonging. One morning the sun rose pale and thin, the sky the color of old pewter. Jonah saddled 2 horses before first light. Clara met him in the barn, breath clouding between them. "I'm coming with you today," she said. He paused, cinch half tightened. Upper pastures rough. Snows drifted deep in places. "I've walked worse." She met his eyes. "I need to see the land I'm asking my children to call home." Jonah studied her a moment longer, then nodded. He handed her the reins to the bay mare. "She's steady. Won't spook." They rode out side by side, the children waving from the porch, until the house shrank behind a rise. The trail climbed steadily, pines closing in their branches, heavy with snow that occasionally dumped in soft avalanches. The air smelled sharp of resin and frost. Clara felt the mare's warmth beneath her, the rhythm of hooves on packed snow steadying her pulse. They reached a high meadow by noon. The wind had scoured most of the snow here, leaving patches of brittle grass. Jonah dismounted, walked to the edge of a drop-off and pointed north. "See that notch in the ridge," he said. "That's where the Mustangs used to cross. Still do some winters. Wild ones. Not many left." Clara swung down boots, sinking to mid-calf. She stood beside him, looking out over the folded hills, the distant blue promise of mountains. The silence was vast, broken only by the soft snort of the horses. "You love this place," she said. Jonah's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Took me years to admit it. Thought I was just passing through. Then one spring I realized I hadn't left in 3 years. The land had claimed me quiet-like." She turned to him. "And now it's got more voices in it." He looked at her, then direct. "Yours. The children's. Makes the quiet different. Better." Clara felt heat rise in her face despite the cold. She looked away toward the valley below where smoke rose thin from the chimney. "Harlan Crow said the note's due in April. Full amount." Jonah exhaled a white plume. "I know. Been selling what I can. Yearlings mostly. Won't cover it all. What happens if it doesn't? We lose the place." The words came plain without drama. "Or we fight it. Sell off more stock, take on hands for the summer, scrape together whatever we can. Or," he paused, "or we walk away before they take it. Start smaller or somewhere else." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. "I've walked away once already. Felt like dying. Jonah stepped closer, close enough she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar that pulled when he spoke. Then we fight. She looked up at him. Together, together. The word hung between them, simple and heavy. Clara felt it settle in her chest like a stone warmed by fire. She reached out slow and laid her gloved hand against his coat, over his heart. He covered it with his own. Neither moved. The wind moved around them, carrying snow from the pines in glittering drifts. When they rode back, the light was failing, the sky bruised purple. The house appeared below them, lamp glow in the windows, like a beacon. The children ran out to meet them, cheeks red, voices high with questions about the ride. Clara slid from the saddle, knees stiff, and caught Samuel as he launched himself at her. Jonah lifted Emily down, then Thomas, his movements, easy, familiar. Inside, supper waited, stew thickened with barley biscuits still warm. They ate by the fire, the children recounting every detail of their day, how Daisy had nuzzled Samuel's pocket, looking for sugar, how Thomas had helped Jonah haul wood. Clara listened, watching Jonah across the table. He listened too, a small smile tugging at his mouth when Samuel mimicked the mare's snort. Later, when the children slept, Clara found Jonah on the porch again, coat open, staring at the stars. She stepped out, wrapped in a quilt, and stood beside him. "I've been thinking," she said. He turned his head slightly. "I don't want to wait for April to decide what this is." She took a breath. "I want to choose it now. You. This place. Us." Jonah looked at her fully then. The scar on his face caught the starlight. "You sure? I've never been more sure of anything since Eli died." He reached for her hand, ungloved this time. His fingers were warm despite the cold. He brought her knuckles to his lips, held them there a long moment. "Then we fight for it," he said against her skin. "All of it." She stepped into him. He wrapped his arms around her, quilt and all, and they stood like that under the winter sky, two people who had lost much finding something new in the space between them. The weeks that followed carried the weight of decision without hurry. Clara and Jonah moved through the days as partners now, not merely two people sharing space. They spoke of the note in practical terms over coffee before dawn, over supper after the children slept. Numbers were written on scraps of paper, cattle sold, wool clipped and carded for market, eggs gathered and traded in town for seed and nails. Every dollar counted, every hour worked toward April. Jonah took to riding out alone some mornings, checking distant fence lines or scouting for stray calves that had wandered into the draws. Clara watched him go, the horse's breath steaming in the cold, and felt the pull of worry she had not known she could still feel. When he returned, face reddened by windcoat, dusted with snow, she met him at the barn door with a tin cup of hot coffee. He took it without words, their fingers brushing. That small exchange became ritual, silent proof. They were in this together. One afternoon in late February, Thomas found an old iron box buried under loose boards in the barn loft. Dust coated it thick. The lock had rusted open years ago. Inside lay a handful of yellowed papers, a deed fragment, a letter addressed to Jonah in a woman's careful hand, a small daguerreotype of a young girl with dark braids and serious eyes. Claire watched Jonah turn the photograph over in his palm, thumb tracing the edge. "Mara," he said quietly. "She sent this the winter after she left. Said she wanted me to remember what I was giving up." Clara stood beside him in the dim light filtering through cracks in the roof. "Did you keep it because you regretted letting her go?" Jonah closed the box slowly. "Kept it because I didn't want to forget what regret feels like, so I wouldn't make the same mistake twice." He looked at her, then direct and unguarded. "I won't let this place or you slip away because I was afraid to fight for it." Claire reached out and took the photograph from him. She studied the girl's face a long moment, then set it back inside the box with care. "Then we fight clean. No more secrets." He nodded once. Word spread quiet through the valley. Neighbors who had kept their distance began to appear: old man Pritchard with a sack of dried apples, the widow Hayes with a jar of pickled beets, and news of a spring cattle auction in Cheyenne that paid better than most. A quiet alliance formed, unspoken but solid. When Harlan Crow returned in March riding with two men in dark coats, papers in hand, the yard filled with horses and hard faces before he could dismount. Pritchard spoke, first voice gravelly from years of tobacco. "You're on private land, Harlan. Calder's note ain't due till the end of the month. You got no business here yet." Crow's smile was tight. "Just making sure the collateral's still in place." Jonah stepped forward, calm as still water. "It's here, and it's staying." Clara stood beside him, chin up, the children behind her on the porch. Samuel clutched her skirt. Emily held Thomas's hand. Crow looked from one face to the next, reading the room. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, rattling dry leaves. No one spoke again. Crow tipped his hat, slow and deliberate. "We'll see what the board says, come due date." He mounted and rode out, the other men following. After they were gone, Pritchard clapped Jonah on the shoulder. "You got friends, son. More than you knew." Jonah looked at Clara. She gave him the barest smile. April arrived with a false spring, warm days, nights still sharp. The creek swelled with meltwater running clear and cold. Jonah drove the last of the yearlings to town, returned with a leather pouch heavy with coin. Claire counted it twice at the kitchen table while the children slept. It was close, dangerously close, but not enough. The morning of the due date dawned clear and windless, the first true stillness in months. Jonah saddled his horse before light. Clara met him in the yard, wrapped in her old shawl. "I'm riding with you," she said. He started to argue, then saw her face and stopped. "All right." They rode into Cheyenne together. The children left with Widow Hayes. The bank stood on the main street, brick and imposing windows reflecting the morning sun like cold eyes. Inside, the air smelled of ink and polished wood. Harlan Crow waited behind a high desk, flanked by two clerks. Jonah set the pouch on the counter. "Count it." Crow opened it, spilled the coins into a brass tray. His fingers moved, quick, practiced. When he finished, he looked up, expression unreadable. $217 short. The words landed like stones. Clara felt the room tilt, then steady. Jonah did not flinch. "Then take what you need from the herd," he said. "But the house stays. The land stays. We'll pay the rest by harvest." Crow leaned back. "Bank don't make deals on promises." Jonah placed both hands flat on the counter. "This bank made a deal with a man who died 2 years ago and left a widow to pay his debts. You took her ranch. You won't take this one without a fight." Silence stretched. One of the clerks shifted. Crow's eyes flicked to Claire, then back to Jonah. "Board meets tomorrow," he said finally. "I'll put your offer before them. No guarantees." Jonah nodded once. They turned and walked out into the sunlight. On the ride home, the sky opened wide above them, blue and endless. Claire rode close enough that their knees brushed now and then. Neither spoke for miles. When the valley came into view, smoke rising from the chimney, the windmill turning slow in the breeze, she felt something loosen inside her chest. Jonah reined up at the crest of the last rise. He looked at her. "If they say no," he said, "we'll load the wagon again. Find new ground. Start over." Clara reached across the space between them and took his hand. "If they say yes, we stay. We build. We make it ours." He squeezed her fingers. "Ours." They rode down into the valley side by side, the house waiting, the children running out to meet them, voices carrying on the wind like promise. The bank's decision arrived by rider on the second morning after Cheyenne, a single envelope sealed with red wax. Jonah met the messenger at the gate, took the letter without a word, and carried it back to the house where Clara waited on the porch, arms crossed tight against the lingering chill. The children hovered just inside the door, sensing the weight of the moment without needing explanation. Jonah broke the seal with his thumb. He read in silence, eyes moving slow across the page. Clara watched his face for any sign, tight jaw, narrowed eyes, but he gave nothing away until he finished. Then he exhaled long and steady and handed the letter to her. She scanned the formal script. The board had voted. The shortfall would be forgiven as a partial payment against future interest, provided the remaining cattle stayed on the property through the next roundup and no further liens were placed. One condition: Jonah must sign a personal guarantee that the land would remain productive for 5 years. No selling. No abandoning. Clara looked up. "They're letting us keep it. They're betting we can't fail," Jonah said. "But they're giving us the chance." She felt the breath leave her in a rush, knees softening for the first time since the foreclosure notice had come. Jonah stepped forward and caught her elbow steady as always. She leaned into him, forehead against his shoulder, and for a long moment neither spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, soft and forgiving. Thomas stepped out first. "Is it good news?" Jonah looked at the boy over Clara's head. "It's ours. For keeps." Emily clapped her hands, once sharp and bright. Samuel ran forward and wrapped his arms around Jonah's leg, face pressed to the worn denim. Jonah rested a hand on the boy's head, fingers gentle in the dark curls. They celebrated quietly that night, no feast, no fireworks, just the things that mattered. Clara baked the last of the dried apples into a cobbler crust, golden and crisp. Jonah opened a jar of peach preserves he had saved since autumn. The children ate until their cheeks were sticky, then sprawled on the rug before the fire, telling stories of the mustangs they would catch one day, the fences they would mend stronger, the garden Clara promised to plant come spring. Later, when the house quieted and the children slept deep, Clara and Jonah sat on the porch steps. The sky was clear, stars sharp as new coins. A half moon hung low, silvering the meadow. Jonah had brought out an old quilt. They shared it across their shoulders. Clara broke the silence first. "I thought we'd lose it. Every day I thought it." "I know," he said. "I thought the same." She turned to him. "You never showed it. Had to believe one of us could carry the hope." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small object, a plain gold band worn smooth by years. "This was my mother's. She gave it to me the day I left home. Said to keep it until I found someone worth giving it to." Clara looked at the ring resting in his palm. It caught the moonlight warm despite the cold night. "I'm not asking for promises you can't keep," he said. "But if you'll have me, if you'll let this be a beginning instead of an ending, I'd like to put this on your finger. Not because the bank says so. Because I choose it. Because the children choose it. Because the land feels right with all of us in it." Clara lifted her left hand. The finger that had once worn Eli's ring was bare now, the skin paler where the band had been. She had taken it off the day the bank came, buried it under the cottonwood with a prayer she could not speak aloud. Now she extended her hand to Jonah. He slid the ring on slowly, carefully, as though it might break. It fit loose but sure. Clara closed her fingers around his, holding him there. "I choose it too," she said. "All of it. You. This place. Whatever comes next." He leaned in, then slow enough she could have pulled away. She didn't. Their lips met, soft, tentative, then deeper, a kiss, born not of hunger but of long patience, finally rewarded. When they parted, foreheads resting together, the night seemed warmer, the stars closer. They stayed on the porch until the moon set, talking in low voices about the spring planting, the cattle drive, the small schoolhouse in the next valley, where the children might go one day. They spoke of names for the baby Clara had begun to suspect might be coming, though neither said it outright yet. They spoke of years ahead, not as promises carved in stone, but as possibilities they would shape together. When the cold finally drove them inside, Jonah banked the fire low. Clara paused in the hallway, looking back at the main room, the table where they ate, the hearth where stories were told, the door to the bedroom where 3 children slept safe. Jonah came up behind her arms, circling her waist from behind. She leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. "This is home," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to the side of her neck. It always was waiting to be. They walked to the bedroom together, hand in hand, the ring on her finger, catching the last embers of the firelight. Outside, the creek ran clear under the stars, the windmill turned slow and steady, and the valley held them all quiet, whole, enduring. More outlaw legends are waiting on Wild West Chronicles.